you want to know why so many of your tracks sound boring and lifeless, then stick around, because in this video I'm going to share with you 3 strategies that you can use to spice up your hi-hats to create better sounding grooves and make your electronic music productions more interesting. If you don't know who I am, my name is Philip from Pick Yourself and I produce, mix and master music professionally full-time in my studio in Berlin. I specialize in electronic music and this channel exists to help you succeed with your productions and in the end, get better music out there. So if that resonates with you, I have a little gift for you. It's called the Finisher Framework. This is a little free guide that you can use to finish at least one great sounding song per month. It's completely for free. You can get it at pickyourself.com/framework. The link is also in the description and I would love for you to check this out. Now, without further ado, let's jump straight into our tutorial on hi-hats. So the problem that I see a lot with the tracks that get sent to me for mixing and mastering in the studio is the following. I get productions that sound overall really good, so the samples are well chosen, the interesting sounds are well designed, but overall the productions just sound very unanimated and very lifeless. And the reason very often is, first of all, a lack of automation and modulation on the sources, but then also in super boring MIDI programming. And this is especially true for the percussion grooves, and the most obvious element that we need to look at are the hi-hats. So let me quickly show you what we have in this session. All right, so this is our track. I'm going to play it for you quickly. So a relatively standard groove. We have a kick, we have a sub bass, a bass, a little bit of texture, noise texture, and also some tonal texture. A clap that also has a slight delay on top of it. Sounds quite nice. And now, what would most producers do when they bring in the hi-hat? They would do exactly what I did here. I called this hi-hat boring. They program this offbeat hi-hat in here and it sounds like this. Now, overall, it doesn't sound bad at all. So the sample is well chosen. It sits perfectly in this overall production, even though everything is unmixed yet. But the problem here is that this groove over an extended period of time gets really boring, and also the listener is probably being annoyed at some point by the same sample playing all the time at exactly the same velocity. Now, how can we solve this? I'm now going to show you how you can transform this simple groove into something very interesting. I'm going to do this in 3 different levels. And the third level is going to be something that sounds like it's totally in a different league. So make sure to stick around for that. But also keep watching the first steps, because otherwise you will not understand how we end up at this immersive sounding, super interesting hi-hat groove. First of all, let's talk about sound design. And this hi-hat is not designed with a synthesizer or a noise source. This is a sample. But still, there are a ton of things that we can do in terms of sound design to make this more interesting. And the first thing that I want to share with you is layering. As you can see, we have a simple MIDI groove that is triggering our sample coming from the Ableton sampler. And this is not something special to Ableton Live. Any DAW that has a sampler built in can do this. You play this sample with your MIDI notes, and if you open up this zone tab here, you can actually see what type of MIDI notes will trigger the sample. And the root note here is C3. And depending on what the sampler is set to, you can transpose or not transpose the sample with the other notes. So the whole keyboard basically is mapped to this sample. Now, if you want to make your groove more interesting, you can do the following. You can restrict the area and say, for example, only our C3 is going to trigger this specific sample, and then you can pull in any other sample from your library and you can continue with different ones. And so the different keys are going to play different samples, and you can also play several ones at the same time. And this is exactly what I did in the next level hi-hat. So hi-hat level 1, this is like the first upgrade. I'm going to mute the first one. Now listen to this. The MIDI groove looks like this. I'm playing different notes here. The first note here, C3, is our standard hi-hat. And the other ones are 2 different noise hi-hats. So one of them is playing with the first original hi-hat, the other one with the next one, first one again, and the other one again. And what this does is it makes our groove more interesting because every hit sounds slightly different from the other one. Let's listen to this now. So this is a really slight variation, but it makes it more vivid, more interesting and sparkly. It's really, really nice. Compare this to our original hi-hat here. So with this simple change, it already sounds much more interesting. So we've adjusted the core sound design of our hi-hat and it already sounds better. But the problem is, over an extended period of time, this still becomes sounding very loopy because it's the same type of loop playing all the time. Now, if you want a hi-hat that's still kind of straight, but has like a little bit of variation to it, the cool trick that I'm going to show you now is going to solve this problem. One of my favorite features in Ableton Live is this duplicate here. So you can basically just make this part longer, and then it gets really interesting because you now can do slight variations of your groove that are not really changing the groove overall, but just spice it up a little bit. So for example, duplicate this note, duplicate this note. Here you could switch this one to here, and then you just listen back and see what happens. You develop a feeling for this, so the more experienced you are, the easier it will be to come up with something that's interesting but not switching up everything in a crazy way. And so what I came up with in my level 2 groove is the following here. Now you can hear that this is already much more interesting, and you can use variations of this throughout different parts of the track, and this is one of the best ways to keep the song more interesting. Now the thing that's left is processing, and I'm going to show you some really cool tricks that you can use here to make this more interesting, and then I'm also going to slightly mix those hi-hats so that they really cut through the mix. So the groove is mainly the same here in our level 3 hi-hats, and I've just added a ton of processing here. I'm going to walk you through some of my favorite tools for this. So the first thing in my chain is the frequency shifter. This is a super cool plugin that lets you, as the name says, shift the frequency of the material. And you can also use an internal LFO to modulate how and when this is shifting. You can shift up, you can shift down, you can also use ring modulation, which is sounding more extreme. But for this specific example, I definitely like this shifting more. So this was just to show you the possibilities of how far you can push this. I keep it relatively subtle. My only goal here is to get even more variety into this material and just to make it more interesting thanks to the changes in frequency. The next tool in my chain is going to surprise you. It's the Corpus tool. Not many people use this, but I promise you this is so rewarding. So what this does is it gives you different options of materials that you can resonate with the material that you're sending into this. So for example, I'm sending my hi-hat now, for example, on this membrane. And there are a ton of options on how to adjust this in a more bright way, in a more harmonic way, in a slightly detuned way. All of this is possible. So I just found a setting that I really like, and I'm only feeding in a tiny bit of that. So listen to this without and then with. So the way that I use this is to very subtly change the character and add interesting, especially side information to this. You can also spread this out a little bit and use it in a way that adds to the core material and almost adds a different texture to it, but not changing it too much. So I'm only feeding in less than 10% of it into the signal. So around 4 or 5% is what I go for here. The next plugin is a true classic for processing hi-hats. It's the vocoder. Look at this and listen to it. I'm using an LFO that uses a random voltage that is smoothed out, so this is why it's curved. And I mapped this to the wet dry setting here. So as you can see, the wet dry knob is moving depending on what this does here. I really like this because it's adding a little bit of randomness to how the individual hits sound. Now, as you can hear, this softens the overall sound quite a bit. If you don't want this, wanted to cut through more, then obviously leave this out. The vocoder is not for every production. In this case, I find it very charming because the overall vibe of the track is a little bit more moody and the hi-hat was almost too sharp for this. So that is it for my classic processing chain. Now, the cool thing is that we can also send part of the signal to another chain, which has the replica delay and a little bit of reverb. Now I want to quickly show you what this does by feeding in a bit of the signal to this send return path. I hope you notice how this creates this super nice backbeat groove, and you can automate this obviously, feed it into certain parts of the song and leave it out in others. I've used a dotted eighth note setting. This is something that in my opinion at least creates a very nice groove. And then this goes into a reverb. This is one of my personal favorites. Only a little bit, so this is less than 20% reverb, and a really dense setting. So high density, which means the reverb is very complex sounding. A short time, so it's just a small room. Here you can also see the algorithm is set to small, and the tone is relatively neutral. Overall, I think this creates a fantastic sounding hi-hat. Now let's quickly talk about mixing and then wrap it up. Mixing hi-hats does not have to be complicated at all. What I typically do is I go for a channel strip, so something like the SSL channel strip by Plugin Alliance, something that I like a lot. If you don't have this one, don't worry, you can also get away with just typical Ableton EQs and a little bit of compression and saturation with the standard tools. You can mimic a similar behavior. But what this does basically, it allows you to dial in I think a little bit of a gritty character, especially if you use the SSL 4000E console. This is kind of the grittiest one in the arsenal, I would say. But I personally like the sound of this 9000J quite a bit. So I will dial a little bit of compression here. Now this obviously makes the signal a little bit louder. You can adjust this here then. So the automatic attack time of this channel is so that the transients really go through well, which is quite nice, but you have to adjust the release time. So quick release time, and the ratio is relatively gentle, 3:1, something like this. And the threshold just means how much of the signal am I feeding into this compressor. The most important thing with hi-hats is to make sure that there's not any strange sub-rumble going on in the sample that you don't want. For this specific sample, I know that this is not the case, but if you want to make sure, you can check out an analyzer and see what it does down there. And then depending on whether you need it or not, you can activate filter, for example, to filter out certain frequencies. A lot of people just by default filter out the low end. As a professional mixing and mastering engineer, I can tell you that this is doing more harm than good. I would definitely not do this. I would only filter when it's actually necessary. In this case, it is not necessary. And then you can dial in certain frequencies that you find pleasing for those hi-hats. For example, if I find that the vocoder adds a nice charming texture, but it sounds not sharp enough anymore, I can dial in a little bit of high mid-range, for example. And a little bit of top end. If I want to have a little bit more punch, meaning that the hi-hat is not as noisy, but more like really metallic, I can go for the low mid-range, for example, and try to figure out what the root note of this hi-hat is and make it stronger. This is obviously unfair because it's too loud. And then one of my favorite tools to make stuff cut through is transient designers. So this is the one by Plugin Alliance. There's also a free transient designer by Flux, the Flux Bittersweet, I think it's called. Transient designer just means it makes the transient, the first snappy part of the signal, even louder. And you can do this here relatively simply by increasing this. So, fantastic sounding hi-hat. I really like what we did here. I hope you did so as well. Let me know in the comments if you have any follow-up questions, and I would love to hear from you soon. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and stay tuned for the next video. I'm publishing every single week, so make sure to subscribe to this channel if you want to not miss out on any new tutorial.